and thanks for watching. I'm Susan Chekalusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL is the 501c3 charity that raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. Learn more at ffrpl.org. We are delighted to present this installment of the virtual version of our Fall 2020 Books Sandwiched In series of book reviews. As many of you know, Books Sandwiched In has been running continuously since 1956. We'd like to thank all of our reviewers who are participating remotely this season, and we look forward to welcoming everyone back to the library when it is safe and healthy for staff, reviewers, and the public. Our fall BSI roster focuses on diversity and inclusion. Today's presentation will be a review of My Vanishing Country, a memoir by Bakari Sellers. Sellers made history in 2006 when at just 22 years old, he became the youngest member of the South Carolina State Legislature and the youngest African-American elected official in the nation. In 2014, he was the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor in South Carolina. A CNN political analyst, Sellers is also a practicing attorney. Our presenter is Dr. Keith Jenkins, Vice President and Associate Provost and Professor of Communication for the Division of Diversity and Inclusion at RIT. Professor Jenkins has also served as RIT faculty in residence, RIT's first Assistant Provost for Diversity, Director of Undergraduate Degree Programs in the School of Communication, and Interim Vice President and Associate Provost in the Division for Diversity and Inclusion. He is the recipient of many awards from RIT, including the Eisenhardt Award for Outstanding Teaching, the Isaac L. Jordan Pluralism Award, the Diversity Trailblazer Award, Provost's Excellence in Teaching Award, and the National Technical Institute for the Deaf's Pluralism Award. His scholarly publications and presentations focus on intercultural communication, political and visual rhetoric, and the rhetoric of gospel songs. Most recently, the focus of his research has been on pragmatism and the rhetoric of inclusion in Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign.
Hello, my name is Dr. Keith Jenkins, Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. I want to begin by thanking Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library for extending to me the invitation to share just a few highlights about a book that I had an opportunity to read over the weekend, written by Bakari Sellers. The book is entitled My Vanishing Country, a memoir. Of course, this is my marked up copy from the weekend. In the midst of this global pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and also the social justice issues related to Black Lives Matter, this book actually proves to be an excellent read, particularly in these times, because he addresses issues of healthcare, and healthcare of profound importance to us, particularly Black and brown communities today. But he also deals with some of the same issues of systemic racism that were being fought in the 50s and in the 60s that pulled or drew his father into this particular movement, those same issues being fought today. So I found this to be an absolutely refreshing read in today's time. I also find it very valuable, particularly to college students, because we can learn about organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an organization that not only was John Lewis a member of, and it led to him speaking at the famed 1963 March on Washington, but we learned that Bakari Sellers' father was also a member of this same organization. And as we began to look at, this organization, and we began to look at other movements of students, it seems very relevant for where we are today as we deal with Black Lives Matter. Bakari does a great job at the beginning of this book and the introduction by giving us an understanding of the community in which he was raised. He was raised in Denmark, South Carolina. He describes it in the text as a community of 3,400 souls, nearly all African American. He goes on to talk about how he thought at one time, based on the rumors of the city, that this city was named after Denmark Vesey. And I loved reading about Denmark Vesey, who plotted a slave revolt in 1822. And he led that rising, but he ended up not being successful. He would be captured and he would be put to death. But it wasn't named after him. But we would learn later of a particular organization that was named after one Denmark Vesey. We learn of shotgun houses, and I hadn't seen that term in a long time. I also grew up in the South, in Arkansas, and so I could relate to many of the things that Sellers talked about in his introduction. The shotgun houses, he said, primarily they were dilapidated shotgun houses. And there was a growing theory is that the name of these skinny homes, which are no more than 12 feet wide, comes from a style of house in West Africa called Shoga, which means God's house. And so he gives us history. And all throughout the text, as you read it, you get all of these nuggets of history, these nuggets of valuable information that will prove very useful to you in understanding not only the culture in the South, but also understanding some of our past and our background. As he describes the city, he describes it with empty downtowns. That is Denmark, South Carolina today. He says, a man from childhood standing outside, and I realize that same man has been standing around there for 20-some years. But he goes on to write that it was once bustling, but it no longer has a hospital. 40 years ago, it would have been pulsing with energy and black light. But what do we see, in those 40 years ago? Denmark had a pickle factory, a Coca-Cola bottling plant, a furniture manufacturing company, people of all trades. He talks about bricklayers and technicians, construction workers, bankers, bakers, painters, cooks, as well as black businesses of every kind. He says, you had some wealth in a place that's 85% black. But he goes on to write that there were significant numbers of educated black people who have always lived in Denmark. And he attributes that to two historically black colleges and universities that reside in Denmark, South Carolina. Denmark Technical College and Voorhees College, where his father was president. So the question for me became, well, what happened to Denmark, South Carolina? Is it more progressive now than it was, when you talk about empty downtowns? And he says, I believe that South Carolina was devastated by the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. He says the textile mills started closing their doors and moving overseas. People started leaving, and with them, all the jobs vanished. So you have a different Denmark, South Carolina today. Some of the other things that he describes were very humorous. Like we get the first glimpses in the introduction of his father. He says that by the time my family arrived in Denmark, my father had already received a graduate degree from Harvard University. Unfortunately, a prison record kept him from getting jobs that he deserved. And I will return to that particular part of the story because it is significant as we go forward. We learned some information also about his mother, who is from Memphis. She had a love-hate relationship with Denmark. She often discussed the difference between country and southern. She believed that his father, was country like Denmark. And how did Bakari respond to that? He says, I, on the other hand, embraced being country like Daddy. Right away, I loved Denmark. So he takes great pride in being black and country and proud. And then some of the things, nuggets that you learn, white bread. He said it was a staple in every household, primarily because it was cheap. And he says, and everyone knew if a fishbone gets stuck in your throat, country folk know all you do is swallow a wad of white bread whole, which pushes the offending bone downward. We learned that you rode bikes or walked everywhere, and so that was a big part of his background. Bakari himself grew to 6 feet 5 inches by age 15. And I said, wow, 6 feet 5 inches. But he says of his basketball skills, he was no LeBron James. He enjoyed his neighborhood, and he enjoyed going to church. He was sensitive, as his mother described him. He was sensitive, but not soft. And she said that was a quality that he also got from his father. And he talked about, going to church, how he loved that. But he says, we went to church every Sunday. But when my grandparents were alive, I dreaded going to church with them because that meant we had to attend 2 churches, Bethel AME and Rome Baptist Church, because my grandparents, weirdly enough, and I still don't know why, attended 2 churches. So he writes and he captures that. But the thing that stands out are values, because you begin to understand the relationships that became very important in his family, but you also come to understand the relationships that would become important amongst his friends. And regarding those relationships and those values that he learned, he said grace before every meal. He says, even now I say grace. I may not say it out loud, but I always close my eyes and bow my head no matter who I'm with. So we learn about him. But the thing that stands out in that introduction to me is a story about Emmett Till. And he goes back to 1955, Money, Mississippi, where a young boy at age of 14 is killed by the name of Emmett Till. And he focuses on Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, who insisted on having an open casket at his funeral, leading to the picture of her son's mutilated face being published in Jet magazine and other media. That was what left a profound effect on his father and changed his father's life, thus impacting Bakari's life much later. He says, Till's death took hold of my father, so much so that at age 16, he was inspired to organize a sit-in demonstration at a local white restaurant in Denmark. He says, my father's inability to forget the face of a murdered black boy is also what motivates me to this day and what got my father in so much trouble in the first place. You see, in Denmark, people know they knew my last name or something else too. That's where my story begins. And I want you to hold on to that. Remember, his father was a Harvard graduate, but there was something that held him back. And that something is dated to February 8th, 1968. It was in this day that about 200 black students at South Carolina State College attempted to desegregate an all-white bowling alley in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And this particular protest led to the deaths of some of those students. This was 1968. It says that they killed 3 young black men. These were patrol officers who came on the scene at that time, all age 18 or younger. And he calls them by name: Samuel Hammond Jr., Delano Middleton, and Henry Smith, and shot and wounded 28 others. And all of this took place in just 8 seconds. And one of the people who was wounded that night was Cleveland Sellers, that is Bakari Sellers' father. He was a young married civil rights activist at the time, and he says, my daddy was arrested, thrown in jail, in a jail cell, and was the only person to spend time in prison for instigating a riot that never happened. And that's when we get introduced in greater depth to Bakari Sellers' father. And we see that he was a gentleman who was not just someone who was associated in a light way with the civil rights movement, but he knew the players, and he knew them intimately by name. He says, I am a child of the civil rights movement. And so he begins, Bakari, to name the aunts and uncles of the civil rights movement. He referred to them as Uncle Jesse Jackson, Uncle Julian Bond, Uncle Stokely Carmichael, Aunt Kathleen Cleaver. And he continues to go through this list of names of individuals who knew his father intimately. He says in 1968, my father was only 23 and a year older than Bakari was when he became a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. He had attended school at Howard University, but he dropped out of Howard in order to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi, where he searched for 3 missing activists. You can imagine who they were: Goodman, Swerner, and Cheney. His roommate when he was at Howard University was Stokely Carmichael. So we learned that before his father left Howard, his roommate was Stokely Carmichael. We also learned that his father's friend, and I thought this was just very wonderful, his father's friend actually officiated or presided over the small wedding ceremony of his father and his first wife. That father's friend was none other than Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he held the wedding in the basement of the famous Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. So we see those glimpses of the fathers, and we see the father's recollection of that incident in Orangeburg, South Carolina. He says, when someone shattered the glass door of the bowling alley that they were protesting, about 50 policemen rushed out, swinging wooden batons and just slamming them down on dozens of co-eds who ended up with lacerations across their heads and beatings across their backs. My father remembers. In some cases, police were on either end holding the girls by their arms while another officer came down across their backs with batons. So that's the memory that he has regarding that particular incident. And what does he say of that? He says that the university's public health researchers said people are wrongfully assuming that individual cops are out to get black people when we look at situations today. He says rather the problem, when you talk about some of the atrocities and the abuse toward black people today with police officers, the problems lies within all of society and how it has treated black people for centuries. And he takes us on a history lesson of those centuries. In the 1960s, he says, my father knew what could happen to someone like him. Accidents do happen all the time. And when he looked at, that history, he was going through his father's things, and he found under books in his father's library pictures. There were pictures of his father standing with Martin Luther King Jr., one of him at the age of 18 sitting in the Oval Office with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And there's another photograph of his father with Muhammad Ali, another with Stokely Carmichael and Elijah Muhammad, several photos with Dr. King or with Dad standing or sitting near Uncle Stokely or Uncle Julian. So he knew these individuals by name, and so we learn a lot about his father. There's another part. They referred to the incident of this protest in Orangeburg as the Orangeburg Massacre. And it occurred 2 years before the well-known shooting at Kent State University, during which 4 white students were killed, and 2 months before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But the tragedy barely permeated the nation's consciousness. And police for that tragedy claimed that they were defending themselves, even though they could not identify and no evidence could prove that even one student on the campus possessed a weapon that evening. The officers sought to pin the calamity on one man, and that one man was Bakari Sellers' father, Cleveland Sellers. And so that is the way that incident went down. In terms of his father, a few other things that he writes about. He writes in that first chapter about 2015, and that was when Uncle Julian passed away. And he says that his death hit my father hard. They were contemporaries and true friends for 50 plus years. But what you see is that his father got very involved at an extremely early age and had this ish situation pinned to him with the Orangeburg Massacre that resulted in him having a prison sentence. And he said that from the time my father was arrested until he was pardoned in 1990, he was like a leper, and we were like refugees. His father, though, was eventually pardoned of that particular incident. And he said, but still, despite that pardon, some people in South Carolina still put the blood and tragedy on his shoulders. But there was a man there at the Orangeburg Massacre who looked like his father, and that man's name was Henry Smith. He died on February 8th. And he said, you know, the primary thing is that they looked alike. And he wondered always if, you know, that gentleman, they thought him to be Cleveland Sellers. Were they targeting to take him out at this particular time? Well, 1 year later, the police were cleared of any wrongdoing by a jury in just 2 hours. So they were found not guilty of the crimes. So he captures all of that in the first chapter of the book. And then he writes 50 years later, and this is extremely important. He says, and yet 50 years after Cleveland Sellers, my father, a professor, college president, civil rights activist, was on the front lines of the civil rights struggle, I find myself in a country that looks too much the same. In my time, in our time, some of the most racist remarks come from the very top, where the president himself panders to the worst in us to score points with a particular political demographic. So he captures a lot of that information. But then when you move into chapter 2 deals with Black and Forgotten. And I think that this chapter stands out to me because chapter 2 focuses on poverty. And he considered Denmark part of the forgotten South. And as he talks about poverty, he begins to deal with this concept of poverty being passed down generationally. He talks about the great migration of blacks from the South, how they went up to Chicago, to Philadelphia, to New York. And he said, and the ones who were left, and remained in the area, they were referred to as country mamas. And, you know, that's what you begin to look at. But as he talked about this idea of poverty being passed on, he says passed down generationally. And so we have 228 years of catching up to do. And he says, how is it passed on? It's passed on for many reasons. He says, unusually high incarceration rates, education inequalities, drugs, segregation, workplace discrimination, and the lack of male role models. And so he goes through this chapter and he deals with his friends. You have to read about his friend Pop. You know, he is one who, you know, did not have all the breaks that Bakari Sellers had. And so he struggled. He had some tough times, but he remains friends with Pop. And so we learn about that. We learn about black versus white net worth in this country. And so that is something else that he decides to focus on. And so he talks about Pop getting shot. But by the time Pop gets shot, one of his dear friends, he says he had already been stabbed, arrested for selling drugs, and spent more than a year in prison. So he says Pop's life was typical of young guys coming out of Denmark without their fathers at that particular time. And so that was something that he alludes to. 2012, he talks about how the only hospital that had been in Denmark had actually closed its doors because of petty politics and a lack of funds. But Pop, this friend of his, would go on to get his GED, would go on to attend college and to graduate from Voorhees. He was inducted into the Alpha Kappa Mu Honor Society. He would spend one semester working on his master's degree at Claflin University in Orangeburg. But remember that similarity that I said? He had spent 1 year in prison. After all that studying, he writes, and a college degree with honors. Pop, who's now 40, works for a company that makes kitchen sinks indoors and is paid $8 an hour. So he talks about the burden of all of this on young people. When you move into the latter parts of this chapter, he begins to identify his friends, and he introduces a term called jibing. Jibing, what we recognize as jibing in Denmark, South Carolina, is playing the dozens, wrecking, signifying, ragging. But in South Carolina, we called it simply jibing. And so he talks about his old friends. One of his dear friends was a gentleman by the name of Jared. And Jared would be the individual that he would later go off to college with. Now, very interesting, Bakari skipped 2 grades. So he would graduate and he would matriculate at college at the age of 16. And so he would matriculate at Morehouse College. And so he writes in chapter 3 about the school days. And the school days, he captures his life at Morehouse College. And you have to read this chapter to get a great feel for the Morehouse mystique, the school's legacy, the Morehouse man, and men like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee, and Herman Cain. He writes about these individuals. He writes about the orientation ceremony of all of them dressing in uniform alike. And that was significant because he says you lose your individuality and become a class of men who are destined to lead. All of that is captured in that 3rd chapter. He also talks about the Houston boys who wore only polo boots, the DC guys who wore only 2 or 3 colors. He went on to talk about the Atlanta guys who were more laid back, the New Yorkers with their massive white T-shirts and hats that were intentionally too big, and the Detroit guys who he says were the sharpest dressers of all. He captures all of them. And he says for he and Jared, they were both just country. And so that's what he looked at regarding them. He also talks about another friend that he would meet there at Morehouse named Brendan Childs. And Brendan Childs said that he was at Morehouse on a basketball scholarship. Well, jibing, Bakari begins to pick at him saying, you know, if somebody looking like you got a basketball scholarship, I know I can get one. So he began to talk trash, you know, at this young guy until he saw Jared actually play. And when he saw him play, all the trash talking stopped at that point. But 2 months into being a student at Morehouse, we were faced with 9/11. And 2 planes crashed, as he writes, into the Twin Towers in New York City on September 11, 2001. And so he begins to talk about how he spent that first year. He spent a lot of it partying. He spent a lot of it, not necessarily focused on his studies. He ended up on academic probation. He lost his academic scholarships. He ended up getting in trouble for being at Spelman past curfew. And for those who do not know, Spelman is the sister school to Morehouse. It is an all-women school. And then he changed majors. And it was in the changing of majors that he ended up in African American studies. There is so much that I could share about this book. He would go after his first summer at Morehouse to work in Jim Clyburn's office. Now, he found out that Jared had gotten a job working in the summer at Jim Clyburn's office. So he wanted to work there also. So he sought that out, but he would discover along the way that there was no opening for him. So he told his mother his dilemma. What did his mother do? She picked up the phone. She called Jim Clyburn himself. She says, Congressman Clyburn, who was former Sumter, South Carolina, and he and his dad had been extremely, close during the 1960s. She said to him, I want my son to be an intern. And they hired him. So he got his first job. What is significant about that is that it was that first job where he began at age 17 now, beginning his plan. He says, I was 17 years old. This is found in chapter 4, when I started thinking about running for political office. Actually, it was during that summer in Congressman Clyburn's office on Capitol Hill. that Jared and I formally plotted my run for South Carolina's House of Representatives. Well, to say the least, he would end up winning that particular seat at the age of 21. And so the planning that started when he was just coming out of his first year at Morehouse, working in Jim Clyburn's office, would pay off much later. So you have to read through that as you get into chapter 4 and the making of a politician in chapter 5. Now move on to chapter 6. That was when we see the introduction of President Obama. And President Obama, dreaming with my eyes open, calls on him to actually endorse him in his run for President of the United States. And Bakari had some stipulations on being able to endorse him. He says, Senator, I said, I would do so under 2 conditions. 1, my mom gets an opportunity to volunteer for your campaign, and 2, you visit my district. And Obama said to him, I have no problem with doing either of those. So we see that Obama keeps that promise, and he does visit, and he gives a lot of clout to one Bakari Sellers. Bakari, in the rest of the book, he deals with so many different subject matters. He deals with anxiety that he suffered, and he deals with this whole idea of mental illness within the black community that some of us as black men would not talk about or deal with. Well, he talks about his own anxiety and how that fared for him. But he ends the book with an incident, and that incident taking place in Charleston, South Carolina. And when you deal with Charleston, South Carolina, learn about his friend by the name of Clem, Reverend Clemente. And you need to read about him also, because he was a dear friend, but he was killed in that church of parishioners who had come together for Bible study. And at the end of a prayer, a young man by the name of Dylan opened fire on them, killing them. And Clem, one of those close friends, was there, and he was killed. What I think I like about Bakari is that he deals with so many different issues. He writes about his wife. He writes about health care and some of the complications she had after giving birth to their twins. And as he writes about all of this, you see that the issues that we were wrestling with in the 60s, that his father, Cleveland Sellers, wrestled with during that time, are issues that we still wrestle with today. And so, what is his call? His call is to be a voice for the voiceless. And so that is one thing that stands out about him. And so I encourage you, read my Vanishing Country, a memoir, Bakari Sellers. Wonderful read, wonderful text. I hope I've done justice to just skimming the surface and giving you some highlights from this book. But I encourage the reading of it because I found it totally enjoyable to read, totally educational, and something that would be rewarding for not only you as a parent or an adult, but for your children and grade school, and for a teacher's reading list if you're considering books that capture this moment in our times. Thank you so much, friends and Foundation of Rochester Public Library, for extending me this invitation to just share with you in this very special way. Take care.